probably have a certain image of Elizabeth as this glamorous, ageless beauty. And that was no accident. Elizabeth's reign is absolutely synonymous with portraits.
There are over 100 surviving images of Elizabeth that date from her lifetime.
Anybody in a position of leadership and authority has to display their image. She needs to be seen to be believed. Portraits in Elizabeth's reign aren't simply to be hung on walls and to accurately represent the Queen.
Elizabeth was the mistress of propaganda.
It was the most audacious work of spin, centuries before the kind of political spin doctors that we think about today. The idea that a woman could rule for so many decades unmarried without being deposed and being regarded now as a monarch of great success is just incredible, really.
She's gone from being Henry VIII's daughter, a princess with very little chance of succeeding to the throne, to a Queen of England who's trying to navigate her way in a man's world. We see her in her portraits go from a girl to an icon. At the turn of the 16th century, portraiture in England was still very much in its infancy. In fact, in terms of the European perspective, it was way behind. In the Low Countries, for example, portraiture had started to become really popular, and the same in Italy. And we start to see lots of artists coming from other European countries to seek patronage in places like France, where we get Leonardo da Vinci, and then we get the German artist Hans Holbein, who arrives at the court of Henry VIII in the 1530s. And this is really a huge turning point for English portraiture, because Holbein's focus is very much on realism and attention to detail. And suddenly the portraits that have once been very flat, very two-dimensional, become very real, with the individual leaping out from the canvas. We also see at Henry VIII's court that miniatures start to become more popular as well, because they are portable, so they're more personal. They can be used and incorporated into jewels, for example. So we know that Henry VIII's sixth wife, Catherine Parr, was very fond of miniatures. Henry VIII, Edward VI and Mary I all had portraits of themselves painted. And we see this happening across Europe as well. Monarchs, rulers, members of the royal family all start to have portraits of themselves being painted.
Increasingly during Henry's reign, and obviously with his children growing up, but then through into Elizabeth's reign, portraits and portrait miniatures in particular became really important as part of the diplomatic marriage networks, as well as being a sign of loyalty that courtiers would have hung in their houses, or even, really small miniatures around their necks.
Elizabeth was the only child of Henry VIII by Anne Boleyn. She was born on the 7th of September 1533 at Greenwich Palace, and to begin with, at the time of her birth, she was the king's official heir. But this wasn't a state of affairs that Henry was prepared to accept, and Elizabeth was born very much in the anticipation that a brother, a male heir, would soon follow. Tragically, this never transpires, and before her third birthday, Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed on charges of adultery and incest, charges that were almost certainly falsified. And from that point on, Elizabeth is declared illegitimate, and it's a state of affairs that is never rectified by her father, because although Elizabeth is later restored to her place in the line of succession, her father never legally legitimates her. And this is a sticking point that Elizabeth is forced to fight against for the rest of her life, particularly when she becomes queen. And she uses portraiture as a way of asserting her legitimacy. There aren't actually many surviving portraits of Elizabeth that date from before her time as Queen, but the family of Henry VIII is one of the earliest that we have, which once hung in the Palace of Whitehall, where it's actually set. It was commissioned by Henry VIII in around about 1545. It's a dynastic piece, as it's intended to emphasise continuity within the Tudor dynasty. The central focus is Henry, sat in the middle, who is flanked by Jane Seymour, his third wife, who crucially is dead at this point. But her inclusion is merited because she had been the mother of the King's longed-for male heir, Prince Edward, who we can see on the King's other side.
In a way, it was an attempt to sort of try and forget all the chopping and changing of Henry's marriages, and instead really suggests a happy family situation that actually, of course, infamously didn't exist.
Although Henry did not intend that either of his daughters should succeed him, they were still an important part of Henry's family, and that's why Mary and Elizabeth are included. Around her neck, Elizabeth wears an initial jewel, and initial jewels were extremely popular in the 1530s and 1540s. But one thing about this piece in particular is striking. It represents the initial A, which can only be representative of Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. So why would Elizabeth choose to identify herself with Anne Boleyn in this blatant piece of Tudor propaganda? Perhaps it was a symbol of loyalty, perhaps this necklace had been given to her. Unfortunately, it's one of the questions that we'll never be able to know the answer for sure. It was probably the following year when another portrait of Elizabeth was painted, perhaps on her father's orders. And throughout her life, Elizabeth was extremely fashion conscious, and this portrait really reflects that, because she was dressed in the finest and the costliest materials. She's got crimson satin, and she's also wearing a very magnificent collection of jewels. But the emphasis on this portrait, when Elizabeth was around 13 years old, is really her learning and her piety, because you can see she's got her finger marking the page of a book. It's probably a copy of the Bible or the New Testament. This really emphasises Elizabeth's scholarly abilities, for which she was renowned.
Having been this demoted figure after the execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn, Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr, has gone to great efforts to try and bring the family back together in some ways. She was a very precocious, very intelligent young woman, proficient in languages. Catherine Parr was an educated, learned woman too, who, with Elizabeth, together they would read the Bible, they would conduct translations. So this represents a pious, precociously intelligent and able young woman at the end of her father's life, about to face the prospect now of her young brother, Edward VI, becoming king.
The other thing to note about this portrait is that Elizabeth is very clearly being identified as Henry VIII's daughter, as per the inscription, which says Elizabeth, the King's daughter. So she's not legitimate, but she is still an important part of Henry VIII's family. And this portrait also later appears in Henry VIII's inventory, which suggests that it may have been commissioned on his orders. In 1553, Elizabeth's half-sister Mary succeeds as Queen of England, and she's the first Queen Regnant of England to be crowned. The idea of female monarchy is quite unpopular because it's unprecedented in England. People are unsure about what's going to happen, and Elizabeth has a particularly difficult time under Mary. In 1554, she was accused of complicity in the Wyatt Rebellion to overthrow her half-sister. Much to her distress, she was forced to endure a spell of imprisonment in the Tower of London. And given that her mother met her end there, we can only imagine Elizabeth's terror at this perilous situation. On the anniversary of her mother's execution, Elizabeth is released from the Tower, but she's taken to endure a spell of house imprisonment under the custodianship of Sir Henry Bedingfield. And it's very clear that Mary harbours this huge distrust for Elizabeth. Nevertheless, by 1558, it was very clear that Mary wasn't going to produce any children of her own. She'd experienced probably 2 phantom pregnancies, and it's only at this point that Elizabeth's ascendancy to the throne has gone from being a possibility to a certainty. Mary died on the 17th of November 1558, and Elizabeth succeeded to the throne on a wave of popular and heartfelt enthusiasm. On the 15th of January 1559, Elizabeth was crowned at Westminster Abbey. We see a dramatic change in Elizabeth's portraiture as well from the time that she becomes queen, because she's gone from being Henry VIII's daughter, a princess with very little chance of succeeding to the throne, to a Queen of England who's trying to navigate her way in a man's world and establish and certify her authority. And portraiture provides a very important way for her to do this. It may have been around this time that a portrait depicting her in full coronation regalia was painted to mark the occasion, although the only surviving image we have of this now dates from much later in Elizabeth's life.
So it's depicting a 26-year-old queen, even though it was painted in 1600 when Elizabeth was coming to the end of her life. And here we have the classic image of queenship. Elizabeth holding the orb and sceptre, wearing her ermine mantle, showing herself enthroned as she would have appeared at the coronation. And this in a way is the kind of poster girl image. And I think many people perhaps see this image as representing the accession of the first queen. Such was the sort of success and ubiquity of Elizabeth's reign. But the reality here is in fact that Elizabeth is wearing the hand-me-down gowns of her half-sister Mary, who in fact was the first crowned Queen of England. And on Mary's death, the coronation robe was hastily refurbished, but then worn again by Elizabeth. And I think that's a timely and instructive reminder, really, that actually Elizabeth did follow her sister Mary, who did wear the crown for the first time. And in many ways, Elizabeth was able to learn from her sister's mistakes, but also kind of benefit from the fact that it had been Mary who had been the first woman to wear the crown and had to negotiate power and being a queen in what was essentially still very much a man's world.
The Hampton portrait, which was commissioned in the early 1560s, is a very rare full-length portrait of Elizabeth. It's one of the only full-length images that we have of the Queen. And this was painted very early in her reign when Elizabeth was the most eligible bride in Europe. So you can see the fruit and the foliage in the background, which is very much an emphasis on fertility. The colours of red and white that have been chosen in Elizabeth's costume were an emphasis on the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster that marked the combined dynasties that Elizabeth had descended from. We can also see Elizabeth holding a glove in a sign of power. This is very much an image that would have been sent out potentially to suitors who were eager to obtain the Queen's hand in marriage.
It shows and represents the young queen that she was at this point, but actually is responding to a particularly perilous time, because quite soon after Elizabeth's accession in 1562, she suffered from smallpox and indeed for a time was unconscious. There was a sense that her life was very much in danger and therefore the future was in a very precarious position. And so this really was a kind of attempt to re-establish her authority after that brush with death, thinking about her both as a Tudor but also as a future wife, because although she was queen at this point, she was also, of course, expected absolutely to marry, not least to have a male partner in government. Women were not regarded as able to govern and rule on their own, but to provide an heir.
In the first few years of Elizabeth's reign, the emphasis was very much on who was the Queen going to marry. And particularly in 1559, rumours began to abound of Elizabeth's relationship with her favourite, Robert Dudley. Of course, Robert Dudley was married, although when his wife died in mysterious circumstances, there were continued rumours that he might end up managing to convince Elizabeth to marry him. Unfortunately for him, the death of his wife put an end to all of those hopes, because Elizabeth realised that to marry him now would permanently tarnish her reputation.
And again, there was suggestion among hostile agents and ambassadors that actually perhaps she wasn't even a virgin, that she in fact had slept with Robert Dudley and others, or that she had some kind of physical impediment which meant that she couldn't have children and therefore wouldn't be a desirable marriage prospect to a foreign prince. So these portraits are saying she's fertile, she's chaste, she's all the things that you would want, as well as trying to emphasise her authority. And we begin to see in this period the need to mask the fact that actually she's getting old. It's important to remember that Elizabeth represented for the Catholics of Europe and of course the Catholics in England, those who had been loyal to Catherine of Aragon and then to Elizabeth's sister Mary. She was this illegitimate pretended queen who should not have acceded the throne. She was Protestant, she was unmarried, and in fact the rightful queen was the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, who on Elizabeth's succession claimed the English throne. So Elizabeth's position was precarious in the early years, and that was expressed in a number of plots and rebellions. So we begin to see an attempt to, in portraiture, respond to a number of different threats. First of all, emphasising the Queen's virginity.
At the beginning of the 1570s, there were those at court privately who had begun to suspect that Elizabeth may not marry, but that was certainly not the image that she was trying to project, which we can see in both the Phoenix and the Pelican portrait, both of which were created by Nicholas Hilliard. Hilliard was actually a goldsmith by trade, and he didn't end up painting very many half-length portraits. In fact, the Phoenix and the Pelican portrait are two of the few half-length portraits that he ever painted, because Hilliard's skill was really with miniatures, but like Holbein before him, the emphasis in his paintings was really on realism and detail.
Relatively recent work has shown that these portraits came from the same workshop, and actually some of the tree dating has shown that they were made around the same time. So we can see the Pelican and the Phoenix portrait as a pair, and we can see the face pattern inverted.
The Phoenix was a symbol that was used regularly by Elizabeth, and it was also symbolic of chastity and rebirth. She is wearing a costume of the very highest value. Elizabeth was really renowned for her wardrobe, and when she died, she reputedly had nearly 2,000 dresses, but all of these were composed of separate elements, which we can see here. We can see the magnificent ruff that she wears around her neck, we can see the fabulous sleeves, and a magnificent bodice, all of which had been embroidered. This was really high status work of the highest quality. The Pelican portrait tries to convey a similar message. It's named because of the pelican jewel that Elizabeth can be seen wearing, and like the Phoenix, this was a symbol that Elizabeth adopted fairly regularly throughout her reign. The emphasis on this portrait is really in motherhood, because the pelican was believed to draw blood from its own breast with which to feed its young. So it's symbolic of Elizabeth as the mother of her nation. At a similar sort of time that the Phoenix and the Pelican portraits have been painted, we've also got the Darnley portrait of Elizabeth. We know that Elizabeth sat for at least 5 artists throughout the course of her life, but this image is particularly important because it was the face from this portrait that many of Elizabeth's later portraits were based on.
This face pattern that became the officially sanctioned one, which it was ordered had to be used in portraits of the Queen, and all portraits